The Gungans are a bit of an infamous species among Star Wars fans. They're mostly remembered as the species of Jar Jar Binks, a character that is, unsurprisingly, not remembered fondly at all. Jar Jar's portrayal as a comic relief buffoon casts a shadow over the Gungans as a species. However, it should not be forgotten that Jar Jar was the exception, not the rule. The Gungans were warriors with a layered history that's darker than one would expect.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Naboo, you see, is a very unusual planet. Its core was dominated by a type of high-energy plasma, which carved its way up through the planet on a constant basis, leaving behind massive tunnels through the inner regions of the planet, most of which were flooded by a massive underground ocean. This made Naboo's ocean system much different from those found on other planets. The waters of the planet came in deep layers, from the shallower seas that dominated much of the surface to unfathomable deep trenches that stretched all the way down into the core. Life evolved on Naboo in an unusual way as a result. Much of the world's underwater plant life consumed the plasma that welled up from the core to survive, and many sea-dwelling creatures consumed these plants for the plasma. Furthermore, the massive and labyrinth nature of the planet's oceans led to the development of monstrous creatures of great size, including the fish-like OPC killer, the bioluminescent Kolo clawfish, and the legendary Sando aqua monster. Life on the surface was much more tame by comparison, and it was among these surface dwellers that the Gungans evolved. As an amphibious species, the Gungans preferred to stick to Naboo's swamps, leaving its mountains and wide grassy plains mostly untouched. They became acquainted with the underwater world of their planet fairly easily in their species development, but didn't settle down there at first, instead choosing to reside in villages in the swamps. The Gungans' technology was a product of the environment in which they lived, which is why it, like Naboo, is so unique. Much of Gungan technology was actually organically grown. The frames of their ships, shields, and even cities were made of a type of coral, which was grown into the desired shape to create a rigid, lasting skeleton for the desired piece of technology. The Gungans also used Naboo's plasma pretty heavily, which they harvested from underwater plant species. Their shields, weaponry, and even their energy membranes that they used for their cities were composed of or were powered by the plasma. In later years, this gave them a slight advantage over outside attackers, as their plasma was a highly efficient energy source and very effective as a weapon against most conventional technology. After the end of Naboo's most recent ice age, Gungan society as we know it began to form. Their villages were constantly preyed upon by packs of bursars, dangerous alpha predators native to Naboo. The Gungans became warriors to fight off the bursars, and they eventually drove the creatures to extinction. In the process, they developed standard tactics and methods of warfare that they retained all the way up until the modern era. The Gungans were the only sentient species to evolve on Naboo, but they weren't always the only sentient species to lay claim to the world. Long before the Clone Wars, a race of ancient reptilian sentients, known in legends only as the Elders, colonized the planet. They went to war with the Gungan natives, forcing them to move underwater. Most Gungan surface villages were destroyed in the conflict, and the Gungans relocated to new underwater cities, which were grown of coral and encircled by bubbles of plasma. The Elders, however, faded from memory long before the events of the prequel trilogy. For reasons unknown, they vanished entirely, leaving only ruins behind. Their crumbling stone monoliths dotted the swamps and plains of Naboo, and over the course of the millennia that followed, the Gungans came to regard the sites as sacred, evidence that Naboo was their world. It was after this that two subspecies of the Gungans, the green-skinned Ankura and the thinner, paler Otola, united, becoming one symbiotic society. Around the time of the Dark Wars, circa 3951 BBY, the galaxy at large finally encountered Naboo. Explorers from the core world of Grismount named the world after the deity Nabu, and the planet quickly became a favorite of hunters due to the diversity of local wildlife. The Gungans ignored these hunters as they generally stuck to the mountains and plains, but they were at least forced to acknowledge the humans around 100 years after the initial discovery, when the humans attempted to colonize Naboo. Amidst a bloody revolution on Grismalt, a group of humans fled to Naboo and established permanent settlements. At Theed and other sites across the planet's grassy plains and mountains, they established themselves a peaceful society of artisans, hoping to find peace in isolation in the far reaches of the Mid-Rim. At first, they didn't clash with the Gungans all that much, but as the Naboo began to multiply and expand across the planet, conflicts began to inevitably break out. But even with the arrival of Naboo, war remained mostly an internal affair for the Gungans. It wasn't until 3000 BBY that they united as a species for the first time after years of bloody intercity wars. It was Boss Gallo that led this effort, which began as a campaign against a vicious warlord named Rogo. Gallo and his Gungan armies eventually succeeded in taking Spearhead, Rogo's base of operations, which the Gungans transformed into Oto Gunga, a city where Gungans of any tribe were welcome. Despite the conflicts and prejudices that separated humans and Gungans, the two civilizations that inhabited Naboo weren't completely isolated from each other. Indeed, both the Gungans and the Naboo depended on trade with each other for survival, though this trade usually went on quietly, on the fringes of both societies. Though the two societies contested the other's claim to Naboo, neither considered the other a significant threat, which is why it took a while for any true major conflicts to flare up. This changed when, after the end of the New Sith Wars in 1000 BBY, a massive civil war began amidst the Naboo. During this time of suffering, Naboo joined the Republic, and in 832 BBY, the conflict was ended by King Jafun, who united the Naboo under his rule. As he rebuilt Naboo's human civilization around Theed, the Gungans finally began to view humans as a threat, having been witnesses to the destruction their war had caused. Matters weren't improved by repeated cases of the Naboo mistreating the Gungans, including at least one in which the Gungans were lured into an arrangement that essentially rendered them slaves to a group of merchants. In 150 BBY, the disagreements between the Gungans and the Naboo finally erupted into open war. The conflict was devastating for both sides, so much so that the Gungans sought to cut ties with the Naboo, and the Naboo renounced violence altogether in regret. The war ended in a victory for the Naboo thanks to the interference of off-world mercenaries, which only served to inflame the Gungan distrust of outsiders. And despite their renunciation of war following the conflict, the Naboo continued to distrust the Gungans, especially when the Gungans began cutting them off from sources of plasma, which fueled the Naboo economy. In 100 BBY, the plasma led to more bloodshed when the heads of several houses of Naboo nobles secretly contracted a mercenary army to wipe the Gungans out. The genocidal campaign incurred heavy casualties for the Gungans, including the destruction of entire underwater cities. But the Gungans and their grand army fought back, and at length they were able to drive the mercenaries from Naboo. Though they suspected the involvement of the Naboo in the war, the Naboo vehemently denied the accusation. Privately, the war led to strife between Naboo's houses, with the patriarch of House Palpatine challenging that of House Tapalo to a duel, one that he ultimately lost. The situation only continued to worsen for the Gungans, unfortunately. Naboo's plasma drew the attention of the wider galaxy, and when vast reserves of it were discovered beneath Theed, the Trade Federation moved in to claim it. Like the majority of Hutt-free Rimworld at the time, the human colonists of Naboo largely relied on the Trade Federation for economic contact with the rest of the galaxy, and so the Federation easily established a monopoly on the planet's plasma reserves. But the Trade Federation was rarely content with controlling only part of a resource, and so they quickly became hostile toward the Gungans, who controlled a large part of Naboo's plasma reserves. The Gungans came to understandably hate the Trade Federation and their droids, the arrival of whom they quickly blamed on the Naboo. The plasma situation ultimately ended well for neither side. Naboo's plasma was part of what made it a target when the Trade Federation ultimately opted to blockade and invade a planet to protest new taxes on trade. The rest of the story of the Gungans is history, and fortunately for them, things only improved for them after the Battle of Naboo, at least until the Empire came around. So, that was the history of the Gungans, another species with a surprisingly dark history. But as per usual guys, I want to know what you think. We've been doing a couple of these dark histories for species lately, and I want to know if you want to see more of this type of content. So if you do, make sure you let us know in the comment section below. And as per usual, just before you go, make sure you check out all those links in the description below if you want to join the wider Geetsly's community. Anyways, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.